Franz Kafka's The Trial. Chapter 7. Lawyer, manufacturer, painter. One winter morning, snow was falling outside the window in a foggy dimness. Kay was sitting in his office, already exhausted in spite of the early hour. To save his face before his subordinates, at least, he had given his clerk instructions to admit no one, on the plea that he was occupied with an important piece of work. But instead of working, he twisted in his chair, idly rearranged the things lying on his writing table, and then, without being aware of it, let his outstretched arm rest on the table, and went on sitting motionless, with bowed head. The thought of his case never left him now. He had often considered whether it would not be better to draw up a written defense and hand it into the court. In this defense, he would give a short account of his life, and when he came to an event of any importance, explain for what reasons he had acted as he did, intimate whether he approved or condemned his way of action in retrospect, and adduced grounds for the condemnation or approval. The advantages of such a written defense, as compared with the mere advocacy of a lawyer who himself was not impeccable, were undoubted. Kay had no idea what the lawyer was doing about the case. At any rate, it did not amount to much. It was more than a month since Holt had sent for him, and at none of the previous consultations had Kay formed the impression that the man could do much for him. To begin with, he had hardly cross-questioned him at all, and there were so many questions to put. To ask questions was surely the main thing. Kay felt that he could draw up all the necessary questions himself, but the lawyer, instead of asking questions, either did all the talking or sat quite dumb opposite him, bent slightly forward over his writing table, probably because of his hardness of hearing, stroking a strand of hair in the middle of his beard and gazing at the carpet, perhaps at the very spot where Kay had lain with Lenny. Now and then he would give Kay some empty admonitions, such as people hand out to children, admonitions as useless as they were wearisome, for which Kay did not intend to pay a penny at the final reckoning. After the lawyer thought he had humbled him sufficiently, he usually set himself to encourage him slightly again. He had already, so he would relate, won many similar cases either outright or partially. Cases which, though in reality not quite so difficult, perhaps as this one, had been outwardly still more hopeless. He had a list of these cases in a drawer of his desk. At this he tapped one of them, but he regretted he couldn't show it, as it was a matter of official secrecy. Nevertheless, the vast experience he had gained through all these cases would now redound to Kay's benefit. He had started on Kay's case at once, of course, and the first plea was almost ready for presentation. That was very important, for the first impression made by the defense often determined the whole course of subsequent proceedings. Though unfortunately it was his duty to warn Kay, it It sometimes happened that the first pleas were not read by the court at all. They simply filed them among the other papers and pointed out that for the time being the observation and interrogation of the accused were more important than any formal petition. If the petitioner pressed them, they generally added that before the verdict was pronounced, all the material accumulated, including, of course, every document relating to the case, the first plea as well, would be carefully examined. But unluckily, even that was not quite true in most cases. The first plea was often mislaid or lost together, and even if it were kept intact till the end, was hardly ever read. That was, of course, the lawyer admitted merely a rumor. It was all very regrettable, but not wholly without justification. Kay must remember that the proceedings were not public. They could certainly, if the court considered it necessary, become public, but the law did not prescribe that they must be made public. Naturally, therefore, the legal records of the case, and above all the actual charge sheets, were inaccessible to the accused and his counsel. Consequently, one did not know in general, or at least did not know with any precision, what charges to meet in the first plea. Accordingly, it could only be by pure chance that it contained really relevant matter. One could draw up genuinely effective and convincing pleas only later on, when the separate charges and the evidence on which they were based emerged more definitely, or could be guessed at from the interrogations. In such circumstances, the defense was naturally in a very ticklish and difficult position. Yet that too was intentional, for the defense was not actually countenanced by the law, but only tolerated, and there were differences of opinion even on that point, whether the law could be interpreted to admit such tolerance at all. Strictly speaking, therefore, none of the consuls for the defense was recognized by the court, all who appeared before the court as consuls being in reality merely in the position of pettifogging lawyers. That, naturally, had a very humiliating effect on the whole profession, and the next time Kay visited the law court offices, he should take a look at the lawyer's room, just for the sake of having seen it once in his life. He would probably be horrified by the kind of people he found assembled there. The very room itself, small and cramped, showed the contempt in which the court held them. It was lit only by a small skylight, which was so high up that if you wanted to look out, you had to get some colleague to hoist you on his back, and even then, the smoke from the chimney close by choked you and blackened your face. To give only one more example of the state the place was in, there had been 4 more than a year now. A hole in the floor, not so big that you could fall through the floor, but big enough to let a man's leg slip through. The lawyer's room was in the very top attic, so that if you stumbled through the hole, your leg hung down into the lower attic, into the very corridor where the clients had to wait. It wasn't saying too much if the lawyers called these conditions scandalous. Complaints to the authorities had not the slightest effect, and it was strictly forbidden for the lawyers to make any structural repairs or alterations at their own expense. Still, there were some justification for proceedings were not only kept secret from the general public, but from the accused as well. Of course, only so far as this was possible, but it had proved possible to a very great extent, for even the accused had no access to the court records. And to guess from the course of an interrogation what documents the court had up its sleeve was very difficult, particularly for an accused person who was himself implicated and had all sorts of worries to distract him. Now, here was where defending counsel stepped in. Generally speaking, he was not allowed to be present during the examination. Consequently, he had to cross-question the accused immediately after an interrogation, if possible, at the very door of the court of inquiry, and piece together from the usual confessed reports he got anything that might be of use for the defense. But even that was not the most important thing, for one could not elicit very much in that way, though of course, here as elsewhere, a capable man could elicit more than others. The most important thing was counsel's personal connection with officials of the court. In that lay the chief value of the defense. Now Kay must have discovered from experience that the very lowest grade of the court organization was by no means perfect, and contained venal and corrupt elements, whereby to some extent a breach was made in the watertight system of justice. This was where most of the petty lawyers tried to push their way in, by bribing and listening to gossip. In fact, there had actually been cases of purloining documents, at least in former times. It was not to be gainsaid that these methods could achieve for the moment surprisingly favorable results for the accused, on which the petty lawyers prided themselves, spreading them out as a lure for new clients, but they had no effect on the further progress of the case, or only a bad effect. Nothing was of any real value but respectable personal connections with the higher officials, that was to say, higher officials of subordinate rank, naturally. Only through these could the course of the proceedings be influenced imperceptibly at first, perhaps, but more and more strongly as the case went on. Of course, very few lawyers had such connections, and here Kay's choice had been a very fortunate one. Perhaps only one or two other lawyers could boast of the same connections as Dr. Holt. These did not worry their heads about the mob in the lawyer's room, and had nothing whatever to do with them, but their relations with the court officials were all the more intimate. It was not even necessary that Dr. Holt should always attend the court, wait in the anteroom of judiciary system which insisted on secrecy from the start. Their remoteness kept the officials from being in touch with the populace. For the average case, they were excellently equipped. Such a case proceeded almost mechanically and only needed a push now and then. Yet confronted with quite simple cases or particularly difficult cases, they were often utterly at a loss. They did not have any right understanding of human relations, since they were confined day and night to the workings of their judicial system, whereas in such cases a knowledge of human nature itself was indispensable. Then it was that they came to the lawyers for advice, with a servant behind them carrying the papers that were usually kept so sacred. In that window over there, many a gentleman one would never have expected to encounter had sat gazing out hopelessly into the street while the lawyer at his desk examined his papers in order to give him good advice. And it was on such occasions as these that one could perceive how seriously these gentlemen took their vocation, and how deeply they were plunged into despair when they came upon obstacles which the nature of things kept them from overcoming. In other ways, too, their position was not easy, and one must not do them an injustice by regarding it as easy. The ranks of officials in the judiciary system mounted endlessly, so that not even the initiated could survey the hierarchy as a whole, and the proceedings of the courts were generally kept secret from subordinate officials. Consequently, they could hardly ever quite follow in their further progress the cases on which they had worked. Any particular case thus appeared in their circle of jurisdiction, often without their knowing whence it came, and passed from it they knew not whither. Thus the knowledge derived from a study of the various single stages of the case, the final verdict, and the reasons for that verdict, lay beyond the reach of these officials. They were forced to restrict themselves so that stage of the case which was prescribed for them by the law, and as for what followed, in other words, the results of their own work, they generally knew less about it than the defense, which, as a rule, remained in touch with the accused almost to the end of the case. So in that respect, too, they could learn much that was worth knowing from the defense. Should it surprise Kay, then, keeping all this in mind, to find that the officials lived in a state of irritability which sometimes expressed itself in offensive ways when they dealt with their clients? was sent rushing upstairs to offer the greatest possible show of passive resistance, and let himself be thrown down again into the arms of his colleagues. That lasted for about an hour. Then the old gentleman, who was exhausted in any case by his work overnight, really grew tired and went back to his office. The lawyers down below would not believe in at first, and sent one of their number up to peep behind the door and assure himself that the place was actually vacant. Only then were they able to enter, and probably they did not dare even to grumble, for although the pettiest lawyer might be to some extent capable of analyzing the state of things in the court, it never occurred to the lawyers that they should suggest or insist on any improvements in the system, while, and this was very characteristic, almost every accused man, even quite simple people among them, discovered from the earliest stages a passion for suggesting reforms which often wasted time and energy that could have been better employed in other directions. The only sensible thing was to adapt oneself to existing conditions, even if it were possible to alter a detail for the better here or there. But it was simple madness to think of it. Any benefit arising from that would profit clients in the future only, while one's interest would be immeasurably injured by attracting the attention of the ever-vengeful officials. Anything rather than that. One must lie low, no matter how much it went against the grain, and try to understand that this great organization remained, so to speak, in a state of delicate balance, and that if someone took it upon himself to alter the disposition of things around him, he ran the risk of losing his footing and falling to destruction, while the organization would simply right itself by some compensating reaction in another part of its machinery. Since everything interlocked and remained unchanged, unless indeed, which was very probable, it became still more rigid, more vigilant, severer, and more ruthless. One must really leave the lawyers to do their work, instead of interfering with them. Reproaches were not of much use, particularly when the offender was unable to perceive the full scope of the grounds for them. All the same, he must say that K had very greatly damaged his case by his discourtesy to the chief clerk of the court. That influential man could already almost be eliminated from the list of those who might be got to do something for K. He now ignored, clearly on purpose, even the slightest reference to the case. In many ways, the functionaries were like children. Often they could be so deeply offended by the merest trifle. Unfortunately, K's behavior could not be classed as a trifle, that they would stop speaking even to old friends, give them the cold shoulder, and work against them in all imaginable ways. But then, suddenly, in the most surprising fashion, and without any particular reason, they would be moved to laughter by some small jest which you only dared to make because you felt you had nothing to lose, and then they were your friends again. In fact, it was both easy and difficult to handle them. You could hardly lay down any fixed principles for dealing with them. Sometimes you felt astonished to think that one single ordinary lifetime sufficed to gather all the knowledge needed for a fair degree of success in such a profession. There were dark hours, of course, such as came to everybody, in which you thought you had achieved nothing at all, in which it seemed to you that only the cases predestined from the start to succeed came to a good end, which they would have reached in any event without your help, while every one of the others was doomed to fail in spite of all your maneuvers, all your exertions, all the illusory little victories on which you plumed yourself. That was a frame of mind, of course, in which nothing at all seemed certain, and so you could not positively deny when questioned that your intervention might have sidetracked some cases which would have run quite well on the right lines had they been left alone. A desperate kind of self-assurance, to be sure, yet it was the only kind available at such times. These moods, for of course they were only moods, nothing more, afflicted lawyers, more especially when a case which they had conducted satisfactorily to the desired point was suddenly taken out of their hands. That was beyond all doubt the worst thing that could happen to a lawyer. Not that a client ever dismissed his lawyer from a case. Such a thing was not done. An accused man, once having briefed a lawyer, must stick to him, whatever happened. For how could he keep going by himself once he had called in someone to help him? So that never happened. But it did sometimes happen that the case took a turn where the lawyer could no longer follow it. The case and the accused and everything were simply withdrawn from the lawyer, and then even the best connections with officials could no longer achieve any result, for even they knew nothing. The case had simply reached the stage where further assistance was ruled out. It was being conducted in remote, inaccessible courts, where even the accused was beyond the reach of the lawyer. Then you might come home some day and find on your table all the countless pleas relating to the case which you had drawn up with such pains and such high hopes. They had been returned to you because in the new stage of the trial they were not admitted as relevant. They were mere waste paper. It did not follow that the case was lost. By no means. At least there was no decisive evidence for such an assumption. You simply knew nothing more about the case and would never know anything more about it. Now, very luckily, such occurrences were exceptional, and even if case were a case of that nature, it still had a long way to go before reaching that stage. For the time being, there were abundant opportunities for legal labor, and K might rest assured that they would not be exploited to the utmost. The first plea, as before mentioned, was not yet handed in, but there was no hurry. Far more important were the preliminary consultations with the relevant officials, and they had already taken place. With varying success, as must be frankly admitted, it would be better for the time being not to divulge details which might have a bad influence on K by elating or depressing him unduly. Yet this much could be asserted, that certain officials had expressed themselves very graciously and had also shown great readiness to help, while others had expressed themselves less favorably, but in spite of that, had by no means refused their collaboration. The result on the whole was therefore very gratifying, though one must not seek to draw any definite conclusions from that, since all preliminary negotiations began in the same way, and only in the course of further developments did it appear whether they had real value or not. At any rate, nothing was yet lost, and if they could manage to win over the chief clerk of the court, in spite of all that had happened, various moves had already been initiated toward that end. inexhaustible. He reiterated them every time Kay called on him. Progress had always been made, but the nature of the progress could never be divulged. The lawyer was always working away at the first plea, but it had never reached a conclusion which at the next visit turned out to be an advantage, since the last few days would have been very auspicious for handing it in, a fact which no one could have foreseen. If Kay, as sometimes happened, wearied out by the lawyer's volubility, remarked that even taking into account all the difficulties, the case seemed to be getting on very slowly. He was met with the retort that it was not getting on slowly at all, although they would have been much further on by now had Kay come to the lawyer in time. Unfortunately, he had neglected to do so, and that omission was likely to keep him at a disadvantage, and not merely a temporal disadvantage either. The one welcome interruption to these visits was Lenny, who always so arranged things that she brought in the lawyer's tea while Kay was present. She would stand behind Kay's chair, apparently looking on, while the lawyer stooped with a kind of miserly greed over his cup and poured out and sipped his tea. But all the time she was letting Kay surreptitiously hold her hand. There was total silence. The lawyer sipped. Kay squeezed Lenny's hand, and sometimes Lenny ventured to caress his hair. "Are you still there?" the lawyer would ask after he had finished. "I wanted to take the tea tray away," Lenny would answer. There would follow a last hand clasp. The lawyer would wipe his mouth and begin again with new energy to harangue Kay. Was the lawyer seeking to comfort him or to drive him to despair? Kay could not tell, but he soon held it for an established fact that his defense was not in good hands. It might be all true, of course, what the lawyer said, though his attempts to magnify his own importance were transparent enough, and it was likely that he had never till now conducted such an important case as he imagined Kay's to be. But his continual bragging of his personal connections with the officials was suspicious. Was it so certain that he was exploiting these connections entirely for Kay's benefit? The lawyer never forgot to mention that these officials were subordinate officials, therefore officials in a very dependent position for whose advancement certain turns in the various cases might in all probability be of some importance. Could they possibly employ the lawyer to bring about such turns in the case, turns which were bound, of course, to be unfavorable to the accused? Perhaps they did not always do that. It was hardly likely. There must be occasions on which they arranged that the lawyer should score a point or two as a reward for his services, since it was to their own interest for him to keep up his professional reputation. But if that were really the position, into which category were they likely to put Kay's case, which, as the lawyer maintained, was a very difficult, therefore important case, and had aroused great interest in the court from the very beginning? There could not be very much doubt what they would do. A clue was already provided by the fact that the first plea had not case handed over to higher authorities. It was absolutely necessary for Kay to intervene personally in states of intense exhaustion, such as he experienced this winter morning. When all these thoughts kept running at random through his head, he was particularly incapable of resisting this conviction. The contempt which he had once felt for the case no longer obtained. Had he stood alone in the world, he could easily have ridiculed the whole affair, though it was also certain that in the event it could never have arisen at all. But now his uncle had dragged him to this lawyer. Family considerations had come in. His position was no longer quite independent of the course the case took. He himself, with a certain inexplicable compliance, had imprudently mentioned it to some of his acquaintances. Others had come to learn of it in ways unknown to him. His relations with Fräulein Purstner seemed to fluctuate with the case itself. In short, he hardly had a choice now to accept the trial or reject it. He was in the middle of it, and must fend for himself. To give in to fatigue would be dangerous. Yet there was no need for exaggerated anxiety at the moment. In a relatively short time, he had managed to work himself up to his present high position in the bank, and to maintain himself in that position, and win recognition from everybody. Surely, if the abilities which had made this possible were to be applied to the unraveling of his own case, there was no doubt that it would go well. Above all, if he were to achieve anything, it was essential that he should banish from his mind once and for all the idea of possible guilt. There was no such guilt. This legal action was nothing more than a business deal such as he had often concluded to the advantage of the bank, a deal within which, as always happens, lurked various dangers which must simply be obviated. The right tactics were to avoid letting one's thoughts stray to one's possible shortcomings, and to cling as firmly as one could to the thought of one's advantage. From this standpoint, the conclusion was inevitable that the case must be withdrawn from Dr. Holt as soon as possible, preferably that very evening. According to him, that was something unheard of. It was true and very likely an insult, but Kay could not endure that his efforts in the case should be thwarted by moves possibly originating in the office of his own representative. Once the lawyer was shaken off, the petition must be sent in at once, and the officials be urged daily, if possible, to give their attention to it. This would never be achieved by sitting meekly in the attic lobby like the others with one's hat under the seat. Kay himself, or one of the women, or some other messenger, must keep at the officials day after day, and force them to sit down at their desk and study case papers instead of gaping out into the lobby through the wooden rails. These tactics must be pursued unremittingly. Everything must be organized and supervised. The court would encounter for once an accused man who knew how to stick up for his rights. Yet, even though Kay believed he could manage all this, the difficulty of drawing up the petition seemed overwhelming. At one time, not more than a week ago, he had regarded the possibility of having to draw up his own plea with merely a slight feeling of shame. It never even occurred to him that the stock exchange, which he had just heard, a story which needed illustrating for the proper appreciation of the point, so that the assistant manager, bending over the desk, took Kay's pencil from his hand and drew the required picture on the page of the jotting pad, which had been intended for the play. Today, Kay was no longer hampered by feelings of shame. The plea simply had to be drawn up. If he could find no time for it in his office, which seemed very probable, then he must draft it in his lodgings by night. And if his nights were not enough, then he must ask for furlough. Anything but stop halfway. That was the most senseless thing one could do in any affair, not only in business. No doubt it was a task that meant almost interminable labor. One did not need to have a timid and fearful nature to be easily persuaded that the completion of this plea was a sheer impossibility, not because of laziness or obstructive malice, which could only hinder Dr. Holt, but because to meet an unknown accusation, not to mention other possible charges arising out of it, the whole of one's life would have to be recalled to mind, down to the smallest actions and accidents, clearly formulated and examined from every angle. And besides, how dreary such a task would be. It would do well enough, perhaps, as an occupation for one's second childhood in years of retirement, when the long days needed filling up. But now, when Kay should be devoting his mind entirely to work, when every hour was hurried and crowded, for he was still in full character and rapidly becoming a rival even to the assistant manager, when his evenings and nights were all too short for the pleasures of a bachelor's life, this was the time when he must sit down to such a task. Once more his train of thought had led him into self-pity, almost involuntarily. Simply to make an end of it, he put his finger on the button which rang the bell in the waiting room. While he pressed it, he glanced at the clock. It was 11 o'clock. He had wasted 2 hours in dreaming, a long stretch of precious time, and he was, of course, still wearier than he had been before. Yet the time had not quite been lost. He had come to decisions which might prove valuable. The attendants brought in several letters and 2 cards from gentlemen who had been waiting for a considerable time. They were, in fact, extremely important clients of the bank, who should, on no account, have been kept waiting at all. Why had they come at such an unsuitable hour, and why, they might well be asking in their turn behind the door, did the assiduous K allow his private affairs to usurp the best time of the day? Weary of what had gone before and wearily awaiting what was to come, K got up to receive